In 1974, Jack and Janet Smurl moved into their Pennsylvania home, expecting a fresh start. But soon, they were plagued by horrific events, a foul stench with no source, chilling whispers, and even physical attacks by an unseen force. The family's desperation led them to seek help from paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren, who believed a dark entity was at work. Was this simply an overactive imagination, or did a true evil presence lurk within? If you're drawn to true crime, haunting, and mystery stories, you're in the right place. We upload twice a week, so be sure to subscribe. And let us know in the comments which haunting or true crime mystery you'd like us to cover next. Now, we enter the terrifying world of the Smurl family haunting. The year was 1974, and the Smurl family was eager to begin a new chapter in their lives. Jack and Janet Smurl, along with their young daughters, Dawn and Heather, were moving into a quiet neighborhood in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. They were an ordinary family, working class, looking forward to creating a peaceful life together. Their new home, a duplex, was modest but felt like a fresh start. It was the kind of house where Jack could imagine their kids growing up, safe and sound. Little did they know that it would become the setting for a nightmare that would challenge their understanding of reality. The move itself had gone smoothly enough. Jack had just received a promotion at work, and while the extra responsibilities weighed on him, it also meant more financial security for his growing family. Janet, ever the optimist, had already begun mentally decorating their new home. She saw potential in every corner, every wall, every floorboard. Despite its age and the need for some repairs, she felt hopeful. Hopeful. After all, it was a house they could truly make their own. But from the very beginning, the house felt different. At first, it was nothing overtly alarming, just an uneasy feeling that neither Jack nor Janet could quite shake. The air inside the house always seemed cooler than it should have been, especially in the upstairs rooms. There was a certain heaviness in some areas, like the air was denser, harder to breathe. Janet would sometimes feel as though she was being watched, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Then came the sounds. It started with light scratching noises in the walls. Jack, a practical man, assumed it was mice and set about putting down traps, but nothing ever turned up. The scratching persisted. At night, the family would hear soft whispers, faint but unnerving. Sometimes the voices seemed to come from the attic, but when Jack went to check, he found nothing but old insulation and dust. There were no drafts, no wind that could be causing the sounds, and yet the whispers continued. At this point, the family tried to rationalize what was happening. The house was old, so it made sense that there would be creaks and groans. They were still settling in after all. Janet, ever the voice of reason, would reassure herself and the girls that the house was just getting used to them. But deep down, a seed of unease had already been planted. Weeks passed, and the odd occurrences began to escalate. Janet was in the kitchen one afternoon, preparing lunch, when she noticed a dark stain forming on the ceiling above. Her heart sank. Plumbing issues were the last thing they needed. But when Jack came to inspect it, he found that the pipes were fine. The stain, which looked like a deep red blotch, couldn't be explained. Even more disturbingly, it seemed to vanish later that evening as though it had never been there at all. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, a light bulb exploded in the living room. Glass showered the floor, and the family jumped back in shock. Jack cursed under his breath, muttering something about faulty wiring, but when he replaced the bulb, everything seemed normal again. The next day, though, another bulb blew out in the hallway. This time, Janet noticed that the air had grown cold moments before the explosion, sending a chill down her spine. As the incidents piled up, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss them as mere coincidences. Jack, ever the rational thinker, tried to maintain control of the situation, He busied himself with work, throwing himself into his job to avoid acknowledging the strangeness at home. Janet, on the other hand, began to feel the strain more acutely. She spent more time in the house than anyone else, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on her more and more each day. One particularly unsettling night, as Janet lay in bed beside a sleeping Jack, she heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing outside their bedroom door. Thinking it was one of the girls, she got up to check. But when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. Her daughters were fast asleep in their rooms, and yet the sound of footsteps continued, echoing faintly as though coming from just out of reach. Fear gripped Janet, but she refused to let it consume her. She told herself it was her imagination, maybe just the house settling. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The house wasn't just old, it was something else entirely. And whatever was there, it wasn't friendly. The children, too, began to notice strange things. Dawn, the eldest, mentioned seeing shadows moving in her room at night, though there were no trees or passing cars that could account for them. Heather, still too young to fully understand, complained of bad dreams. She would often wake up crying, saying there was someone in her room watching her. Janet did her best to comfort her daughters, but inside, her anxiety was growing. Jack, still unwilling to fully accept what was happening, brushed off their concerns. He chalked it up to stress from the move, but as the days turned into weeks, even he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He would come home from work and find the lights flickering, or a door that had been firmly shut would now be wide open. Still, he insisted that they could handle it, that it was all in their heads. But one night, something happened that shattered Jack's skepticism. As he and Janet were watching television in the living room, a foul, rotten stench filled the air. It was so overpowering that it made them gag. Jack leaped up, convinced there was a dead animal trapped somewhere in the house, but after searching every inch of the room, he found nothing. The smell lingered for hours, then disappeared just as suddenly as it had arrived. From that moment on, Jack could no longer deny that something was terribly, horribly wrong with their new home. The once warm promise of a fresh start had been overshadowed by a creeping darkness, something neither of them could explain but both could feel. The house, which had once represented hope and security, was now a source of fear and uncertainty. And as the days passed, the Smurls began to realize that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop, it was only just beginning. As the chapter closes, the family's unease is palpable. They are trapped between denial and dread, unwilling to admit what they all now suspect. They were not alone in that house. Something unseen and malevolent had taken root, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. This would be the beginning of their long, harrowing battle against an evil they could neither see nor understand. As the weeks turned into months, the Smurl family's sense of unease morphed into outright fear. What had begun as strange sounds and fleeting shadows became impossible to ignore. The malevolent presence in their home was growing stronger, and with it, the intensity of the disturbances. The first sign that things had taken a darker turn came one afternoon when Janet was alone in the house. She had just put Heather down for a nap and was folding laundry in the bedroom when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her heart quickened. Jack wasn't due home from work for hours, and the children were asleep. She tried to stay calm, convincing herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more deliberate, as though someone or something was pacing just outside her door. With shaky hands, Janet crept to the hallway, half expecting to see one of the girls out of bed. But the hallway was empty, and the air was thick with that now familiar chill. She stood there, frozen, as the footsteps seemed to move through the house. They thudded across the ceiling, down the stairs, and into the kitchen. Janet's breath caught in her throat. There was no explanation for it. It felt as though an invisible intruder was making its way through their home, indifferent to her presence, but undeniably there. When Jack came home later that evening, Janet recounted the events, her voice trembling with fear. But Jack, still clinging to the hope that all of this had a rational explanation, downplayed her concerns. "Old houses make noise," he said, though he knew in his heart that this was no ordinary creak or groan of aging wood. That night, the family was jolted awake by a series of violent bangs. It sounded like someone was slamming doors all throughout the house. Jack leaped out of bed, rushing down the hallway to check on the girls. They were huddled together in Dawn's room, their eyes wide with terror. Dawn insisted that she had seen a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed just moments before the noises began. This time, Jack didn't have an answer. He checked the windows and doors, ensuring they were all locked, but nothing was out of place. The banging had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Janet stood in the hallway, clutching her robe tightly around her, feeling utterly helpless. Whatever was in their home was no longer content with being subtle, it was making its presence known. As the days passed, the activity in the house grew more physical. Objects began to move on their own. It started small. Janet would find the kitchen chairs out of place or the TV remote on the opposite side of the room. But soon, larger items were being tossed around as though by an invisible force. One afternoon, as Janet was preparing dinner, a heavy cabinet door swung open and slammed shut with such force that it cracked the wood. The noise startled her so badly that she dropped the knife she was holding, cutting her hand in the process. Blood dripped onto the countertop as she stood there, frozen in shock. The children, too, were affected. Dawn and Heather would often wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, insisting they had seen people in their rooms. Dawn spoke of a shadowy figure that seemed to follow her around the house, always just out of sight but unmistakably there. Heather, barely old enough to understand, became withdrawn, refusing to sleep in her room unless someone was with her. Even during the day, the girls were on edge, jumping at the slightest sound or movement. Jack tried to maintain a sense of control, but the strain was beginning to show. He started staying at work later, desperate to avoid the suffocating atmosphere of their home. But even at the office, he couldn't escape the feeling that something dark had latched onto his family. His co-workers noticed the change in him. His once easygoing demeanor had been replaced by exhaustion and irritability. It wasn't just the physical disturbances that weighed on them. The emotional toll of living in constant fear was taking its toll. Jack and Janet, who had once been a loving and supportive couple, now found themselves snapping at each other over the smallest things. Tension hung thick in the air, not just from the entity that haunted them, but from the cracks it was creating in their marriage. One night, as Jack sat in the living room trying to distract himself with the evening news, the smell returned, the same foul, rotting stench that had overwhelmed them before. It seeped into the room so suddenly and so intensely that he gagged. He rushed to open a window, but the smell clung to him, making the room feel even more suffocating. Janet, who had been upstairs putting the girls to bed, came downstairs with a look of horror on her face. "It's in their room, Jack," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can feel it. It's watching them." Jack didn't want to believe it, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. In the days that followed, things only got worse. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, a deep growling sound filled the air, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Jack and Janet froze, the girls crying in terror as the sound grew louder, more menacing. It felt as though the house itself was alive, a malevolent force surrounding them, closing in. For the first time, Jack found himself admitting the unthinkable. There was something in their house, something beyond their understanding. The fear that had been gnawing at him for months was now fully realized. They were not imagining things, and this wasn't some harmless poltergeist. This was something darker, more dangerous. Despite his reluctance, Jack agreed to seek outside help. The tension in their home had become unbearable, and the safety of their children was now at stake. Janet had been begging him for weeks to call anyone who could help. She had heard of people who specialized in these kinds of situations, people who had experience dealing with the supernatural. Though Jack still felt a flicker of doubt, he knew they could no longer handle this alone. The day after the growling incident, Jack reached out to a local priest. He was skeptical at first, but willing to listen to their story. The priest agreed to visit their home, offering to perform a blessing in the hopes of dispelling whatever evil was lurking there. But when he arrived, the house seemed to fight back. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The priest, visibly shaken, said prayers and sprinkled holy water throughout the rooms, but it did little to calm the atmosphere. That night, the disturbances grew even worse. As the family huddled together in the living room, the lights flickered wildly, plunging them into darkness. A loud crash came from the kitchen, as though all the dishes had been hurled to the floor. Jack ran to investigate, but found nothing out of place. The house was playing with them, tormenting them in ways that defied logic and reason. Janet could no longer hide the deep sense of dread she felt every waking moment. She had always believed in the goodness of the world, but now, faced with the unrelenting terror in their own home, she was starting to lose hope. The entity seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger with every passing day. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a slow, deliberate attack on their sanity, their faith, and their family. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls are on the verge of breaking. Jack's skepticism has been shattered, and Janet's resolve is weakening. The paranormal disturbances are no longer random. They are targeted, deliberate, and malicious. The family is trapped in a nightmare they can't escape, and as they stand on the precipice of despair, they know one thing for certain. Whatever is in their house has no intention of leaving. By now, the Smurl family had reached a breaking point. The eerie occurrences that once felt like unsettling background noise to their lives had transformed into a full-fledged assault on their sanity and safety. They could no longer deny what was happening inside their home. Something dark, malicious, and far beyond their control had taken root. With no other options left, Jack and Janet made the difficult decision to seek outside help. They needed answers, and more importantly, they needed a way to reclaim their lives. Janet had heard whispers about a couple who specialized in cases like theirs, Ed and Lorraine Warren, well-known paranormal investigators with years of experience. The Warrens had built their reputation by helping families who were dealing with the unexplainable. They weren't just ghost hunters. They were demonologists who had encountered entities far worse than a typical haunting. It was a last-ditch effort, but the Smurls were desperate. They hoped that the Warrens could offer some sort of explanation, or better yet, a solution. The first meeting with Ed and Lorraine Warren was one of cautious hope. The couple arrived at the Smurl residence in the late afternoon, their faces solemn yet kind. They had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that eats away at people's peace of mind, leaving them fragile and unsure. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, could feel the heaviness in the air before she even stepped through the door. She looked at Janet with a mixture of sympathy and concern, knowing full well what might lie ahead. Inside, the house was as cold and unwelcoming as ever. Ed wasted no time in setting up his equipment, audio recorders, infrared cameras, and temperature gauges. He wanted to document every possible sign of the paranormal. Lorraine, on the other hand, walked slowly through the rooms, her eyes half closed as she reached out with her mind, trying to connect with whatever presence lingered there. Her expression darkened as she moved from room to room. "There's something here," Lorraine whispered to Janet as they stood in the hallway, her voice barely audible. "It's not just one spirit. I can feel multiple presences, angry, confused, and something much darker. Much worse. Janet's stomach twisted in knots. She had known, deep down, that it wasn't just her imagination. But hearing it confirmed by someone like Lorraine Warren made it all the more terrifying. Ed approached, his brow furrowed. "We're dealing with more than just a haunting here," he said. "There's a demonic entity in this house, possibly more than one. It's feeding off the fear, off the tension in the family." The word sent a chill down Janet's spine. Demonic. She had feared as much, but hearing it spoken out loud was like a punch to the gut. Demons weren't just ghosts. They were something far more malevolent, something designed to harm and destroy. The Smurls weren't just dealing with a few bumps in the night. They were facing an active threat, one that had already begun to tear at the fabric of their family. The Warrens explained that such entities often latched onto people, not just places. Demons could be drawn to negativity, emotional pain, conflict, or unresolved trauma. Jack and Janet couldn't help but think back to the struggles they had faced in recent years. Jack's difficult job, Janet's bouts of anxiety, the stress of raising young children. Had the house sensed their vulnerabilities and taken advantage? Ed suggested performing a spiritual cleansing of the home. It wouldn't be easy, he warned, and there was no guarantee that it would work right away. Sometimes, these entities fought back when threatened, lashing out even more violently. But the Smurls were willing to try anything. The first cleansing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, the Warrens advised the family to stay strong and not to give in to fear. "That's what it wants," Ed explained. "The more you give into it, the more power it gains. Stand together as a family and don't let it divide you." But standing strong was easier said than done. That very night, after the Warrens had left, the activity in the house reached a new level of terror. Jack and Janet were jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud crash downstairs. It sounded like furniture had been overturned. Jack rushed to investigate, his heart pounding in his chest. The dining room table had been flipped on its side, chairs strewn across the floor. Yet there was no sign of anyone, no intruder, no open windows, nothing that could explain the mess. As Jack stood there in disbelief, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the room. It was low and menacing, vibrating through the walls like an animal stalking its prey. Jack felt a surge of panic, his breath catching in his throat. He had never heard anything like it. He backed away, feeling an icy presence behind him, though when he turned, there was nothing there. Upstairs, Janet was trying to comfort the girls, who had been awakened by the noise. Dawn was sobbing, her voice shaking as she told her mother about the dark figure she had seen standing at the foot of her bed again. Heather was too scared to speak, clutching her blanket as though it were her only protection from the malevolent force lurking in the house. The following day, Ed and Lorraine returned to conduct the cleansing. Armed with holy water, crucifixes, and prayers, they walked through the house, blessing each room, calling on the entity to leave. Lorraine led the spiritual rites, her voice steady but tense. Janet and Jack followed closely, praying silently, hoping against hope that this would be enough to rid their home of the evil presence. At first, the house seemed to resist. The air grew cold, and the smell of sulfur filled the air, an unmistakable sign of something unholy. The lights flickered violently, and a mirror in the hallway shattered as if struck by an invisible force. The house groaned, as though it was alive and angry. But Lorraine pressed on, her prayers louder, more forceful. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the house seemed to settle. The oppressive feeling lifted, if only slightly. For the first time in months, Janet felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't over, she knew that much, but the tension that had been suffocating them had eased, if only for the moment. Ed warned the family that they might not be rid of the entity entirely. Sometimes, these things took time. Demonic forces in particular were known for their persistence. They would retreat, only to return stronger if given the chance. Stay vigilant, Ed told them. This could be just the beginning. For a few days, the house was quiet. Jack and Janet allowed themselves to feel a small flicker of hope. Maybe the worst was behind them. Maybe the blessing had worked. But just as they began to relax, the activity returned this time with a vengeance. It started with the shadows. Janet noticed them first dark, shifting forms that moved just out of the corner of her eye. No matter where she was in the house, she felt like something was watching her, lurking just beyond her vision. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like a distant conversation, but soon they grew louder, more distinct, until they sounded like voices speaking right next to her. But no matter where she looked, there was no one there. The final straw came one night when Jack was lying in bed, trying to sleep. He felt a pressure on his chest, as though something heavy was sitting on top of him, pinning him down. He tried to move, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by an unseen force. A cold, suffocating presence filled the room, and Jack's heart raced as he struggled to breathe. He tried to call out for Janet, but no sound escaped his lips. Suddenly, the pressure lifted, and Jack gasped for air, sitting up in bed. His body trembled, slick with sweat, and the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Janet had seen enough. Whatever they were facing was beyond anything they could handle on their own. They needed more help, and they needed it fast. The Warrens, though willing to help, knew that they would need to call in reinforcements. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an all-out battle between good and evil, and the Smurls were caught in the crossfire. The question that loomed over them all was simple yet terrifying. How much more could they endure before the house? And whatever was inside it claimed them for good. The Smurl family was trapped in an unrelenting nightmare. The spiritual cleansing performed by Ed and Lorraine Warren had offered only a brief respite. Now, the dark presence in their home was more aggressive than ever. Each night brought new terror, and even the daylight hours offered no true peace. Jack and Janet were no longer just afraid. They were exhausted, physically and emotionally worn down by the relentless assault on their family. As the days passed, they found themselves locked in a fight for their survival, both against the entity and against the growing strain on their own relationship. After Jack's terrifying encounter with the unseen force in their bedroom, the family knew they could no longer remain passive. They couldn't wait and hope that the activity would subside on its own. It was clear that the entity had no intention of leaving them in peace. Jack, who had once been the skeptic, was now the most determined to take action. He could no longer stand to see his wife and children suffer. He was determined to protect them, no matter the cost. The first step was reaching out to the church again. The priest who had blessed the house previously had been reluctant to acknowledge the possibility of something demonic, but after hearing about the escalation of the events, he agreed to return. This time, he brought with him another priest who specialized in exorcisms. The word alone sent a chill through Janet. The idea that their situation had grown dire enough to require such measures was horrifying. The two priests arrived one afternoon, armed with holy water, crucifixes, and Bibles. They walked through the house with solemn expressions, reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water in every room. Jack and Janet followed behind them, clutching their children close. Lorraine Warren had warned them that an exorcism was not a simple fix. It wasn't like in the movies. There were no dramatic confrontations with the demon, where everything would be resolved in a single moment. It was a long, grueling process, and sometimes it didn't work the way people hoped. As the priests moved from room to room, the atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier. The temperature dropped, and a sense of unease settled over everyone. The entity was not pleased by their efforts, was resisting. Janet could feel its presence more acutely than ever. It was as though the very walls were watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the middle of the blessing, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Everyone froze. It sounded as though something heavy had fallen, yet there had been no one upstairs. Jack and one of the priests rushed to investigate, only to find that the bedroom mirror had shattered, glass scattered across the floor. The air in the room was thick with the unmistakable stench of sulfur, a sign that the entity was growing more malevolent. Jack felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he stared at the broken glass. It was a reminder that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple haunting. The priests finished the blessing, but their faces betrayed the doubt they felt. The entity had not been driven out, it had only been angered. Janet's hope, which had already been dwindling, now felt crushed beneath the weight of despair. She could see the exhaustion in Jack's eyes, the toll this battle was taking on him. He was doing everything he could to protect their family, but the strain was becoming too much for him to bear. As the days passed, the entity's attacks became more personal. It wasn't just about fear anymore, it was about control. Jack, in particular, seemed to be targeted. He would hear voices whispering in his ear when no one else was around, telling him that he was powerless, that he couldn't protect his family. Objects would move in his presence, as if taunting him, reminding him that he was up against something far beyond his understanding. He began to lose sleep, plagued by nightmares and a constant sense of dread. Janet watched helplessly as the man she loved slowly unraveled under the pressure. The children were not spared either. Dawn, who had always been the most vocal about seeing shadowy figures in her room, now refused to sleep alone. She was terrified that the entity would come for her, and nothing Jack or Janet said could ease her fear. Heather, who had once been a carefree toddler, was now withdrawn, clinging to her mother's side at all times. The once happy family dynamic had been shattered, replaced by a constant undercurrent of tension and anxiety. One evening, as they sat in the living room trying to distract themselves with a movie, the lights suddenly flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the air grew icy cold. Jack jumped up, grabbing a flashlight, but before he could turn it on, a low growling sound filled the room. It was the same sound they had heard before, deep, guttural, and undeniably evil. Janet's heart raced as she clutched Heather to her chest. She could feel the presence in the room, circling them as if toying with them. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the room was silent once more. But the sense of dread remained, hanging over them like a dark cloud. Jack was at his breaking point. He had always been the rational one, the man who could fix things with his hands or his mind. But this was something he couldn't control. It was eating away at him, and he knew that if they didn't find a solution soon, it would destroy them. He had to do something, anything, to regain control of his life and his home. That night, as Jack lay awake in bed, unable to sleep, he made a decision. He would fight back. He wouldn't let this entity take everything from him. He began researching ways to defend against demonic forces, reading everything he could find about spiritual protection, exorcisms, and prayer. He reached out to anyone who might be able to help, from religious figures to paranormal experts. He refused to give up, even as the entity continued to wear him down. One of the experts Jack contacted suggested that the entity might be using the negative energy in the house to grow stronger. The family's fear, anger, and despair were fueling it, giving it more power. If they wanted to weaken it, they would need to change their approach. Instead of focusing on the fear, they needed to focus on positivity, on love, faith, and unity. It sounded almost impossible, given the circumstances. But Jack and Janet were willing to try anything. They began to make small changes in their daily lives, trying to reclaim their home in any way they could. They prayed together as a family, ate meals together, and spent time doing activities that brought them joy. It wasn't easy. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of their eyes, reminded them of the darkness that still lurked in their home. but they were determined not to let it win. Slowly, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. The oppressive feeling of dread that had hung over them for so long began to lift, if only slightly. The entity was still there, still watching, but its power seemed to be weakening. The growling stopped, the violent outbursts became less frequent, and the shadows that had once plagued Dawn's room seemed to retreat. But the fight wasn't over. Jack and Janet knew that they were still vulnerable, and that the entity could strike again at any moment. They had to stay vigilant, to remain strong in the face of the unknown. Their love for each other, their faith, and their determination to protect their children would be their greatest weapons in the battle ahead. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls had begun to reclaim their lives, but the threat of the entity still loomed large. They had learned the key to survival wasn't just in fighting the darkness, it was in refusing to let it consume them. The Smurl family's ordeal had stretched far beyond what they could have imagined. What began as strange noises and unsettling encounters had spiraled into a nightmare that dominated every part of their lives. They had survived for months, enduring the torment of the dark entity that inhabited their home. Through the help of experts like Ed and Lorraine Warren, priests, and their own resilience, they had managed to hold on. But they knew that the haunting had not ended. The entity, while seemingly weakened, still lingered in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. And it was during one of the darkest nights that the final confrontation unfolded. It had been a few weeks since the last major incident, and the family had started to feel a cautious sense of relief. Jack had continued his efforts to keep the negative energy at bay, focusing on family unity and positive reinforcement. Janet, too, had thrown herself into taking care of the girls, finding comfort in the small moments of normalcy they could still cling to. But the entity had merely been lying in wait, its attacks growing less frequent but more intense. That night, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost tangible, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Janet was upstairs, tucking the girls into bed, while Jack sat downstairs in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, but not really watching. He was exhausted physically and mentally, but his mind refused to shut down. There was always that lingering anxiety, that feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. As Janet kissed Dawn and Heather goodnight, she felt a chill sweep through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, a familiar coldness that sent a wave of dread through her body. She pulled the blankets tighter around the girls, whispering reassurances that she didn't quite believe herself. She told them to sleep tight, but everything would be okay, even though the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. Downstairs, Jack felt it too. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. His heart rate quickened as he set the remote down, his eyes scanning the room. He couldn't see anything unusual, but he didn't need to. He knew it was back. Before he could call out to Janet, the lights began to flicker. It started softly at first, a faint buzz as the bulbs dimmed, but within seconds, the flickering became violent. The entire room throbbing in harsh, rapid flashes of light and dark. Jack stood up, his instincts kicking in as he moved toward the stairs to get his family. But as soon as he reached the bottom step, a deafening crash echoed through the house. The sound was so loud it felt like the walls were shaking, and it was followed by a deep, guttural growl, the same growl that had haunted them before. "Janet!" Jack shouted, his voice cracking with fear as he bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. Janet had already heard the crash, and she was racing down the hallway toward him, her face pale. "The girls," she gasped, but Jack grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the bedroom. They had to get the children and leave the house, now. But the entity had other plans. Just as Jack reached for the bedroom door, it slammed shut with a force that knocked him back. He stumbled, pulling Janet with him as they both struggled to regain their footing. The door remained closed, though neither of them had touched it. Behind the door, they could hear Dawn and Heather screaming high-pitched, terrified shrieks that made Janet's blood run cold. "Let us in," Janet cried, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard Jack threw his weight against it, it remained locked, held by some invisible force. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway went out, plunging them into darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon through the window illuminated their surroundings, casting long shadows across the floor. The growling returned, louder this time, and it was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if something was moving toward them from the other end of the hall. Jack's pulse raced. He had never been so scared in his life, but he knew he couldn't give in to fear. The entity thrived on it. He had to stay calm, for Janet, for the girls. Grabbing her hand, he pulled her close, whispering words of reassurance, even though every fiber of his being screamed to run. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deep, raspy voice, one that sounded neither human nor animal, echoed through the hallway. It was speaking in a language Jack didn't understand, guttural and harsh, but the intent was clear. The entity was taunting them, asserting its control over the house, over their lives. But Jack wasn't about to let it win. "Get out of our house!" Jack yelled, his voice hoarse with desperation. He grabbed the crucifix from his pocket, the one he had been carrying ever since the Warrens had warned him to keep it close. Holding it high, he began reciting the Lord's Prayer, his voice shaky but determined. Janet, her heart pounding, joined him. She didn't know if it would work, but it was all they had. Together, they stood side by side, their voices rising above the growling, the footsteps, the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. At first, nothing happened. The entity seemed to grow stronger, the air around them growing thicker, suffocating. But Jack refused to stop. He continued to pray, louder now, as if willing the words to push the darkness back. And then, slowly, the growling began to fade. The footsteps ceased, and the air grew lighter. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on them lifted, if only slightly. The door to the girls' room suddenly flew open, and Jack and Janet rushed inside, finding Dawn and Heather huddled together on the bed, shaking and crying but unharmed. Janet scooped them up, holding them tightly, whispering over and over that everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure it was. The entity wasn't gone. They could still feel it, lurking in the shadows, watching them. But for the first time in months, it had backed down. They had stood their ground, and it had retreated. For the next few weeks, the house remained quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had once filled every room was lighter, and the family began to breathe a little easier. But they knew they weren't safe, not completely. The entity was still there, waiting for its chance to strike again. Jack and Janet took the girls to stay with relatives while they continued to work with the Warrens and the church to find a permanent solution. They couldn't live in fear forever, and they couldn't allow the entity to destroy their family. They had survived the worst of it, but the fight wasn't over. It never truly would be. For families like the Smurls, haunted by forces beyond human understanding, the battle between light and dark was a constant one. But they had learned something important. No matter how strong the darkness seemed, as long as they stood together, it could never fully win. In the end, the Smurl family had endured what many would consider unimaginable. They had faced an evil that most people never encounter, and they had survived. Their story was one of resilience, of love, and of the unbreakable bond that held them together through even the darkest of times. And so, the Smurl family's nightmare continued, leaving them and all who followed their story with lingering questions. Were they truly victims of a dark, malevolent force, or was something else at play? The haunting remains unsolved, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lurk beyond our understanding. If you enjoyed this episode of True Crime, Tales of Haunting and Mystery, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Share in the comments if you believe the Smurl family's tale, and let us know which haunting or true crime mystery you'd like us to dive into next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next chilling tale.